Don't miss out on the final football game of the season with Prize Picks. Join now because Prize Picks are giving away a free pick for the big game where 1 yard equals 1 win. Just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Download the Prize Picks app and use code FIELD and get $50 instantly when you play $5. That's code FIELD on Prize Picks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Prize Picks. Run your game. Must be present in certain states. Visit prizepicks.com for restrictions and details.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now, you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. Whenever someone finds out I love horror movies, read horror books, and host multiple horror-themed podcasts, the first question they always ask is, why do you love horror? I usually give different answers depending on the person I'm talking to, but they all lead to the same basic conclusion. I've always loved it, as far back as I can remember. And that's true. I can't remember a time where I didn't love horror. Recently, though, I've been thinking more about it. Not so much because I want to give a better answer, but because today is the 1-year anniversary of my dad's passing, and I owe my love for horror, in large part, to his influence. If you've been listening for any part of the past year, you know the Red Treehouse is his show. What you don't know is why. Today I'll tell you. And along the way, my story will also be a tribute to my dad, whose name, like mine, is Will. My hope is that you'll come to meet a part of who he was, someone who always had a spooky story, loved horror movies and shows, and despite his flaws, was a good dad. In this special tribute episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore my horror origin story, and along the way, we'll try to answer this question: are horror fans born or made? I'll share the stories. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. I have no doubt that if you're a horror fan, you've seen what I think is the scariest movie of all time, The Exorcist. If you haven't, you're missing out on one of the most influential films ever made. And in a lot of ways, It was a movie that paved the way for what horror would become in the decades ahead. It was also the movie that set me on a course to today. It's funny, because my mom remembers my horror origin story differently. In her remembrance, I first watched The Exorcist with my grandfather when I was 10 years old. And she's not wrong, except for 3 small details. I was 9 years old when I first watched it. The time I watched it with my grandfather was the second time I'd seen it. The first time, I watched it by myself. The year was 1993, and 9-year-old me was living in Brooklyn, New York with my parents and younger brother, with my youngest brother on the way. I don't remember the exact month, but I remember sometime that year, WPIX, Channel 11, was broadcasting The Exorcist on network television. Side note, I'm not making this up. I actually did some digging and confirmed WPIX did in fact broadcast The Exorcist in 1993. Anyway, I saw the trailer for the movie a few days before it was broadcast, and I remember my dad saying something like that was the scariest movie I've ever seen, and my mom agreeing with him. Right then and there, I hatched a plan to watch that movie, one way or another. The night of the broadcast, I must have gone to the bathroom a dozen times. Except instead of using the bathroom, I was sneaking The Exorcist in small, 3-minute binges. I couldn't have watched more than 20 minutes combined, and there was barely anything scary. I went to bed that night pretty satisfied. I'd seen the scariest movie ever made, and lived to tell the tale. Hell, it wasn't even that scary. More hype than anything else. My 9-year-old brain didn't realize that network television takes out all the good, scary parts. So what I saw was the most watered-down version of The Exorcist possible. The next morning, I woke up as usual and got ready for school. Back in those days, we walked to elementary school with a small group of friends we would pick up along the way. I couldn't wait to talk shit to all of my 4th grade friends about how I'd watched The Exorcist the night before. The human brain is a funny thing, and the memory is notoriously unreliable. But I remember my mom telling me my dad had a surprise for me when he got home from work. Except when we talked yesterday, she didn't remember this, so it was likely I just filled in the gaps in my memory. Anyway, when my dad got home that evening, he pulled me aside and asked if I was okay because I'd gone to the bathroom a million times the night before. I did my best to play it off. I drank a lot of water, that kind of thing. He kinda laughed and pulled out a VHS that he'd rented from the video store around the block from the house. You guessed it. It was The Exorcist. Except this version wasn't on network television and didn't have the good, scary parts taken out. I don't know how he knew I was sneak watching the movie the night before, but he knew. You know what I ended up doing that night? Watching The Exorcist on VHS by myself in a dark bedroom, practically shitting my pants. There was nothing I could do. If I closed my eyes, the demonic voice filled my ears. If I covered my ears and closed my eyes, I worried El Cuco would come and snatch me up. I remember my dad came in at some point, maybe halfway through the movie, and watched it with me. I laid in bed that night wide-eyed and unable to fall asleep, partly because I was terrified of closing my eyes, but mostly because I knew I loved horror movies. And if I could survive watching The Exorcist, I could watch any other horror movie out there. Listen, I realize there will be some who listen to this and think my dad renting The Exorcist for his 9-year-old son was a bad move. Except here's the thing. I welcomed it and dared myself to do it. I was born in the 80s and came of age in the 90s, the decades that brought us Are You Afraid of the Dark, The Outer Limits, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Tales from the Crypt, Millennium, Twin Peaks, Unsolved Mysteries, and my all-time favorite, The X-Files. I grew up reading Goosebumps by R.L. Stine and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. And when The X-Files first premiered, I watched it through the crack in my parents' bedroom door. I remember watching Alien Autopsy on a Friday night with my parents sitting behind me. You couldn't keep me away from it. In 1995, author Caleb Carr published my all-time favorite book, The Alienist. I remember my dad purchasing a copy shortly after it released, and he kept me from reading it until I was 18. Much like sneak watching The Exorcist, I was determined to sneak read The Alienist. Except sneak reading is a lot harder when he kept the book in his work office in Midtown Manhattan. I didn't read The Alienist until I was an adult, and a few years ago, I bought him a hardcover, signed first edition copy. Now, it's sitting on the bookshelf in my podcasting space. My dad was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and though he lived in New Jersey for the last 28 years of his life, he worked as a building manager in Midtown Manhattan for most of his adult life. He was good at what he did, and to hear it from a not small number of people, he was the best at what he did. I believe them. My dad never had a shortage of spooky stories or strange, scary experiences to share. Back when we lived in Brooklyn, we'd gather on the front stoop and sit around for hours listening to the men in the family tell ghost stories. Growing up in the city, it was the closest I came to sitting around a campfire. It didn't matter that there was traffic all around us, or a constant flow of people walking past. When they started telling stories, it felt like the whole world went dark, and the hair on my body stood on end. I don't know how many of those stories were true. I know at least a few of them were. It didn't matter. As a young kid, there was something special about sitting there with the grown-ups. It almost felt forbidden. Like if I made a sound, I'd be kicked out of the club. After the stories were told, I can remember more than a few nights looking up at the sky, hunting satellites, and calling them UFOs. For me, being spooked was as much a part of growing up as playing wiffle ball in the street, or getting ice cream from the Mr. Softy truck, or opening the fire hydrant on a hot summer day. We moved to New Jersey in 1996 when I was in 7th grade, and for the first time I discovered an old Reader's Digest book, Into the Unknown. It was full of articles about things like ghost photography, ESP, faith healing, UFOs, poltergeists, and more. I must have read that book 1,000 times, enraptured by the pictures and stories, and without fail, anytime I brought it up to my dad, he had his own story to share. Like the time when he was a kid, and he saw the ghost of his grandfather sleeping in his bed, the outline of his body visible underneath the covers. Or the time he was trying to fall asleep in his office, except when he turned the lights out and put his head on the pillow, he heard someone whisper in his ear, "Get out." There are times when he put on glow-in-the-dark eyes and waited until we were in bed, lights out, before standing in the corner green glowing eyes scaring the shit out of us. Or the time he dressed up as Kayako from The Grudge and walked around croaking like in the movie. For lots of teenagers, the thought of hanging out with their parents, especially in public with their friends, is out of the question. But when I was in high school, my friends all hung out at my house, with my dad right there in the mix. More than a few times, we went ghost hunting at the haunts in and around our area. A group of us, sometimes as many as 10 or 12 of us, went to places like the abandoned slaughterhouse, a mile deep in the woods, Kill Yourself Bridge, the haunted convent near Igo Road, and a few other places. Each time, he wasn't just a chaperone to keep us safe. He was a participant to ensure we had fun. And truly, we had a great time scaring the hell out of each other. It's been over 20 years now. Over the years, we'd always talk about the scary stuff we experienced or movies we'd watched. When he visited our home in Virginia in November 2022, we spent some of that time trying to find evidence that our house is haunted. We didn't find anything conclusive then, but our house is haunted for sure. If you don't believe me, listen to Red Treehouse episode 6. In early 2023, I launched the Horror Lab, a horror movie review podcast where I, along with my terrific co-host Chris Lee, dissect the best in horror movies. We hit the ground running, and my dad listened faithfully, often suggesting movies to review. In September 2023, I launched the Red Treehouse, a passion project that I love even now. My dad listened religiously, and we often talked multiple times a month about the show. He'd leave comments on Spotify, which you can still read. Yes, the name is Will, but it's not me talking to myself. It's him talking to me. He'd recommend show topics or stories, the last of which was episode 31, The Jersey Devil. My dad got sick just a few months after the Red Treehouse launched, in December 2023, and he passed away less than 2 months later, 1 year ago today, February 7th, 2024. He was imperfect, like all of us. He had great moments, and not so great moments, like all of us. He was complicated and complex, like all of us. But really, he was the life of every gathering, and had a gravity that pulled you in. I'll share one story from his funeral service last year. Towards the end of the service, one of the guys who worked with him pulled me aside. I'd never met him before, and he was a young guy, maybe in his mid to late 20s. After offering his condolences, I asked how he knew my dad. Making small talk. He started by saying, "Your dad saved my life." For the next few minutes, he told me how my dad offered him a job after meeting him on the street outside the building. He was homeless and trying to kick his substance addiction. He met my dad on the street while asking him for change. Instead, my dad gave him a job as a porter, sort of a catch-all job in the building. By the time I met him at the funeral, he'd worked in the building for over a year, had worked through rehab, moved into his own place, and was building his life. I'll never forget that story. It encapsulates the best of who my dad was. He passed away a year ago today. The Red Treehouse will always belong to him. I love you, Pop. As we close this episode of The Red Treehouse, we're left with this lingering question. Are horror fans born or made? I don't know the answer, but I do know, at least for me, my dad is the reason I love everything horror-related. What about you? I've shared the stories. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.